Hey everybody, my guest today is Dr. Piers Turner, and we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill and free speech. All right, Piers, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. And so I'm Piers Turner. I'm in the philosophy department at Ohio State University. I'm also the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values there. And I'm a Mill scholar primarily, and so have written a number of things on his moral and political philosophy in particular, some on his political economy. And so I love any opportunity to talk about Mill.
I have to say this right in the beginning that John Stuart Mill is the reason why I got into philosophy. I read On Liberty in my senior year of college, and it just changed my life. Before that, I did not care about learning or education whatsoever. But then after that, I just did a complete 180, and I started reading and educating myself in my free time. So John Stuart Mill, he's just my favorite.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he's not perfect, and we could talk about that if you wanted, although that may go beyond some of what we're going to talk about today. But he's pretty inspiring, and I think for someone in the 19th century writing about a lot of these issues and thinking about what liberal society could look like, he really understood a lot about the dynamics in ways that I think is still important for us today. I will say, I think one interesting thing about my own work, potentially, is that a lot of people do read On Liberty, and then they think they understand Mill. But one of the important, I think, features of what I'm trying to do, however well I'm doing it, is to say that that's not enough. To really understand Mill, you have to get beyond On Liberty, and I think that's one of the things I'm always trying to encourage people to do when I'm writing about Mill.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. To really understand an author, you have to kind of understand him, one, in the context in which he was writing, but also in the context of all his other works.
Yeah.
So I probably have a superficial understanding of Mill and his argument in favor of free speech. So I'm looking forward to learning more about it. How would you summarize his argument in favor of it?
Well, thanks. So there's a lot to unpack here. So I do want to register just right at the beginning that I am one of the people who thinks that it makes sense ultimately to talk about On Liberty as a whole as a co-authored work by Mill and by his spouse at the time, Harriet Taylor Mill. Actually, the book was published after she died, but Mill tells us that they went over every word together. And I think by my current standards of co-authorship, it makes sense to think of this as a co-authored work. I am going to just say Mill for the sake of simplicity, but I want to just put that out there. With that, I think, Mill tells us in his autobiography that the overall argument On Liberty is that it's a sort of a philosophical textbook on the importance of individuality and social diversity to individual and social progress. And so freedom of discussion primarily needs to be understood in that context. Free discussion is just crucial to the project of learning from each other so that we can make social progress. So, I mean, in a sense, that's the main core argument. And then, we could start to unpack pieces of it. And then there are really sort of two main parts of this chapter 2 in On Liberty that is, arguably the most famous thing ever written on freedom of speech. And there's sort of two main parts. There's one towards the beginning of the chapter where he makes some claims about what he calls the assumption of infallibility, that he says the silencing of discussion amounts to an assumption of infallibility. That we're not entitled to make. And I'd be happy to talk about that a bit more. The basic claim there is that we're never in a position of such epistemic superiority over all future decision makers that we're entitled to silence discussion. So the assumption of infallibility is not really about thinking that you're infallible. It's sort of assuming a position with respect to future decision makers that only infallibility or something very close to that could potentially justify. And so he says, but we're never in that position. So we are fallible. And so we do need to always leave open the means for further discussion and for improved decision-making. The second part of the argument, which is what people tend to focus on more, is a more straightforward consideration of the good and harm of silencing discussion. And so there he does two things. One is he says, imagine that the prevailing view in a society was false, and but discussion was being silenced on that view. well, then what we do is we lose the opportunity of exchanging truth for falsehood, right? And so we are fallible, and so it is always possible that the prevailing view is false. And so I think this is his main argument there, to say that just truth is very important, that search for truth is very important to developing for social improvement. And so we need to always remain open to the possibility of being wrong, and isn't there great value in exchanging truth for falsehood? But the second part of his argument is he says, imagine that the prevailing view in society is actually true, and even certainly true. And he says, even then, you'd still want to preserve freedom of discussion, because it's only through freedom of discussion that we stay in touch with our reasons, basically, so that the truth that we believe doesn't just become dead dogma, but is actually something that we understand why it's true, and so that we can apply it appropriately in new circumstances. And he thought that was also a pretty important reason. But I think people sometimes push back on that a little bit more. So then, the gist of that second kind of the good and harm kind of part of his argument is just that he thinks the good of silencing discussion is always outweighed by the good of not silencing discussion. He just thinks on balance, it's so valuable for us to have that free discussion that he says ultimately he thinks we should never be silencing discussion.
I would say that I lean towards his position, although I think the interesting and important question is what the limits are, right? Because you may think that, in a particular situation, let's say in a philosophy class, right? In a college level philosophy class, maybe there's certain topics that shouldn't be discussed because we just think that it's not really worth discussing them. Like, let's say if somebody wanted to have a debate over the moral permissibility of slavery, right? I feel like it's one of those topics. It's like, well, I'm not really sure if we're going to gain much from that, right? Because it might be one of those few issues where the debate has been settled and it's just obviously wrong. And if we discuss it, it's just going to be offensive.
I think that's fair, and I think Mill could accommodate that in a certain way. It's there is a difference between silencing discussion or just kind of like not taking it up as an active topic. I mean, right? So I think he's worried about coercion, and so he would say that somebody who is engaging in sort of sincere and fair-minded discussion and is offering up this viewpoint that we might find horrible should still be allowed to express that viewpoint and potentially even sort of taken seriously and engaged as somebody who's trying to take part in this practice of discussion. But that doesn't mean that as a critical community, we can take up all ideas equally all the time, right? There's a limit on what we can take up and what we can't take up at any given time. And so there does have to be some judgment by a critical community about what ideas are worth pursuing at any given time. And so I think you can say both that right, we don't need to be talking with flat earthers all the time. But that doesn't mean we should be silencing discussion on that topic if some people want to pursue it.
Okay. So then depending on the context, then there has to be some judgment made either by, a professor in a classroom or perhaps a community if it's a community discussion.
That's right. And I think the challenge is, though, maybe the hard kind of case that you're thinking of is where there's a judgment call being made about whether some view is a view that is just so has been tried and failed, and so we don't really need to take it up anymore. It's not really a live option anymore. Versus sort of in doing that, basically, essentially silencing an opinion that could be helpful to us, especially if we think about, again, what I led off with is if the main argument about liberty is kind of about learning for the sake of improvement, then when you don't take up some viewpoint, you do potentially lose the opportunity to learn from that viewpoint. And I think we do need to think about that.
I always felt that there was some correlation between how much a person values freedom of speech and how humble they are, in regards to their epistemic limits. Because I feel that if you were a person who was confident that your beliefs were true, then you wouldn't necessarily see that much importance of allowing people to say things that you just thought were obviously wrong. right? But if your position was, well, yeah, I don't really know, like I just lean towards this position, I just lean towards that position, but I don't know, I'm not an expert on this issue, then I would feel that you would lean towards supporting and adopting the importance of freedom of speech.
That's right. Mill, I think, initiated a kind of argument for liberalism that one could also see in maybe Dewey and also later in Popper, that you might think of as kind of open society liberalism, where the core idea is this idea of open-ended learning. So Mill was a utilitarian, but he didn't think we had just like all the answers at hand. So that it was going to be important, even from his utilitarian perspective, that we're always engaged in a collective project of open-ended learning together. And that project requires, roughly speaking, kind of liberal social conditions where people are able to express different ideas, pursue different experiments in living, and then where we can learn from each other going forward. And I think the challenge for that tradition within liberalism has been to try to turn itself into a tradition itself, something that we can all imbibe as helping to define who we are, at least as citizens or as members of a public, and that we're all willing to sort of work together on. And for people in that tradition, right, then the danger comes from people like those you were sort of alluding to, people who don't see themselves as having much to learn, those who think that the beliefs that they have are just sort of settled and couldn't be revised in any kind of way. Those are the people who end up becoming dangerous. Dogmatic thinkers become the danger to liberal society in that tradition.
Thank you for bringing up utilitarianism, because I think that some people who are in favor of restricting free speech also give a utilitarian argument, right? So in the case of COVID, there was some discussion over, whether certain views should be censored. And I think the argument is like, well, yes, certain views need to be censored in regards to something like a global pandemic, because if people are allowed to express these falsehoods, then it's going to lead to a lot more suffering. It's just going to lead to a lot more death. So we have to censor these people. What do you think Mill would say about that?
Yeah, there's kind of a lot to say on this, because I think Mill was sensitive to these kinds of arguments and has to take them seriously as utilitarian. So as we already saw, he felt that on one hand, it was kind of silencing discussion indefinitely anyway is a kind of illegitimate move because we're fallible and no one's entitled to take up that position. The other set of arguments, there was kind of this balance of goods and harms. And in that part of the argument, right, he has to take seriously. If someone says, well, there's this kind of harm that could result from the expression of certain opinions, Mill has to think, he has to take that seriously as a utilitarian. But as we saw on balance, in terms of the cases he said, at least when it comes to discussion, he didn't think that the balance of goods and harms would justify restrictions on speech, or on the expression of opinion. But there's really more to say about this. So let me just take a minute. One is to really understand how much Chapter 2 of On Liberty is not about all expression of opinion. It's only about this thing he calls discussion. He uses that term very consistently. And discussion is really a subset of the expression of opinion that's defined by certain norms of fair play and sincerity. And he gives lots of examples in other writings of cases where the expression of opinion is appropriately restricted. So it's not that Mill was not saying, that all expression of opinion must be allowed. That would be to misunderstand sort of what he was an absolutist about. Like, he was an absolutist about allowing free discussion in the spirit of fair and sincere sort of exchange of ideas. But he was not an absolutist about all expression of opinion. So, for instance, in other writing, he says, and actually in On Liberty, Chapter 3, he mentions a case of incitement, where the expression of an opinion could amount to incitement. In other works, he says, well, an expression of opinion could count as private libel, which he thinks is appropriately restricted. Or there could be a threat to someone's equal rights, or a threat to public safety, or treason. At one point, he even says public decency could potentially be a reason for restriction. So if you take the treason case, you say, look, if I go into a public square and I start expressing my opinion about the king or whatever, and the reasons for us to rise up against the king, he says at some point what happens is that speech, even if I'm really just expressing my opinion about things, stops being merely discussion and becomes a new kind of act. And he says when your expression of opinion becomes some kind of new kind of act that is criminal or tied to some kind of significant harm, right, then it becomes something that can be appropriately restricted. And so I think that that's just so important for understanding the limits of the argument of Chapter 2, is what he's an absolutist about is not all expression of opinion, but just about discussion understood in this kind of norm-laden way. So you might then say, okay, well then what about discussion? Could discussion itself ever be harmful? And there, I think also Mill is a little bit more complicated than people think. In Chapter 2, so he can allow that discussion could be offensive to people, a kind of a very lightweight harm, potentially. He allows that discussion could lead to sectarianism for those taking part in a discussion. And towards the end of the chapter, he also acknowledges that power dynamics in a discussion make it the case that the powerful can sometimes stigmatize the less powerful for the opinions that they hold. And so that's a kind of harm, even in discussion, that is of stigmatization. And so, it's again not the case that there's no potential harm in discussion. It's just that he thinks the harms are outweighed by the goods of allowing free discussion. But that means if you came to Mill and said, well, look, but there's this other kind of harm involved in discussion that you didn't notice in the 19th century, and it seems like we should be taking account of that kind of harm in our balance of goods and harms, Mill would at least have to take that seriously. He might still argue on balance that we wouldn't want to restrict discussion because on balance it could harm say our social learning from each other or invites abuse in some way that's dangerous. But he at least would have to take it seriously. And just one last thing on this, I know I'm going on a bit. If we go back to my original point that all of On Liberty is about the connection between liberty and progress, basically through learning, being able to learn from each other, then and freedom of discussion is also partly justified on that basis. If you could show Mill that having a system of free discussion was actually in some way undermining the process of learning from each other, for instance, if louder voices were able to drown out, more powerful voices were always able to drown out the voices of the less powerful. And so actually, for the sake of learning, we might need some bits of restrictions or regulation. Again, I'm not saying Mill would sign up for it, but he would take it seriously. He would have to, like the kind of arguments that he cares about. And so I think sometimes Mill gets introduced into these discussions as if like, oh, well, we never learned the lessons of Mill because he's this absolutist about free speech. But actually, when you go and look at Mill, he's got he understands some of the problems with speech. He sees that, expression of opinion is not always this sincere, fair-minded discussion that he most cares about. And he also sees that there could be harms involved in discussion that at least are worth talking about. And so I really want to encourage people to get into the complexity and the nuance of the argument that Mill is making.
Thank you for that clarification. So I have a couple of thoughts. One is that I'm not entirely sure how to make this distinction between a person expressing their opinion and having a discussion, right? Because let's take the case of Twitter. If I tweet something and, I express my opinion and nobody responds, then I guess it's just an expression of opinion. But if I then tweet back and forth with somebody in the comment section, then does that become a discussion? And is that therefore then like protected, or at least Mill thinks that is, that has more importance than just me tweeting without nobody responding?
Yeah, it's interesting. If we think about Twitter, it's a little bit how we think about, or X or what it's called now, we think about Twitter as a kind of a virtual public space. Then I think if someone tweets out an opinion about, say, some public matter, I think at a first glance, we should take that as an effort at discussion, right? It is social media. So when you put something out there, you're hoping people read it, you're thinking people might respond. So you're taking the first step in a discussion. Now, where Mill would worry is like, is there a point at which what you're tweeting is not just really a sincere, again, fair-minded effort at engaging in discussion with others, but where you're actually trying to incite something. It has the form of the expression of an opinion, but in expressing that opinion, it's understood that what you're really doing is trying to incite people to certain kinds of threatening behavior. And now that's a fine line. I mean, we don't know, there's judgment calls about that, but at least as a matter of what the principle is that Mill's got in mind, I think that's what it is.
Okay. And that just brought up another issue. So let's say the opinion that I tweet is about the ineffectiveness of a COVID vaccine. Okay. And I'm doing it sincerely. Now, perhaps I do have a political goal. Perhaps I do want to incite change. Isn't that consistent with this idea that free discussion leads to improvement, right? Because I think this would lead to progress.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a classic case where Mill would say, look, we should not be restricting viewpoints in sincere and fair-minded discussion. Like, that's the core claim. So then, again, where could that view go wrong? And again, this is going to require judgment calls that are not always easy to police. But if actually you're not just sincerely expressing that viewpoint, but you are engaging in something that's manipulative, or you're actually trying to sort of effectively coerce somebody into doing something, or you're demeaning them in some way, then I think he thinks, well, look, then that's no longer discussion in the way that he cares about protecting. But he does think, there could be very objectionable views from your perspective, from most people's perspective, from almost everyone's perspective. But if they are offered up in the right spirit, then I think he thinks you should not be restricting the expression of that viewpoint.
No, thank you for that. I feel like the most controversial cases of censorship are cases like that, right? Like people, even free speech advocates, they're not saying that it's really important for people to express hate, right? It's not about that. It's about legitimate disagreements over important issues that affect our society today. So one example would be some conservative speaker coming to give a talk at a university and then protesters shutting it down, right? I feel like that's a common occurrence.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And it's also very, I mentioned these sort of judgment calls. Sometimes it's hard for us if we're deeply committed to a viewpoint and we really believe in the justice of a certain view, for us to take seriously the thought that someone who's expressing the opposite view could be doing so sincerely. Like that they just really have a different perspective on, say, what justice requires, as opposed to having a more motivated viewpoint that's about sort of trying to advance the interests of their group or themselves. And I think, again, it's going to be very hard to tell when that's the case. So if you have a speaker come in who's expressing, I guess we don't need a real example, but expressing some very controversial viewpoint that others find offensive and worse, we're not always going to be able to tell, like, is that person just trying to engage in legitimately in some sincere discussion? And I don't think Mill has an answer for us on that one, except I do think he is in not just in that one chapter of On Liberty, but in other work, he is, I think, encouraging us to think that the default position should be allowing the expression of opinion because there are dangers of silencing that expression. So somebody might reveal themselves to be manipulative or to be trying to coerce or merely persuade people for their own interest. And then we could maybe shift gears, but at least as a starting point, we should allow them to have their say. Now, it's important always, I think, for, say, universities to keep in mind that doesn't mean there can't also be counter-protests, right? There can't be other people using their speech to say that we disagree with what this person is saying. It does not mean that somebody having their say is being endorsed by the whole university just because, say, some group invited that person onto campus. I think, so I think there's room for both pushback and for, really understanding the long-term value of free discussion does not mean you're endorsing everything that's being expressed in that discussion.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you think that there is a special place for free speech on college campuses? Like, do you think the importance of free speech, the degree to which it should be protected, differs depending on the context?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a settled view on that, except to say, at least with respect to universities, I think universities are precisely the sort of place where the mission is aligned with, again, what we led with, this idea that the goal is learning, and we wouldn't be at a university thinking about learning if we thought we already had all the answers. And so there is a kind of default position that we should be open to hearing a wide variety of ideas and thinking about them seriously. And it doesn't mean you can't have your beliefs or that I can't have my beliefs, but we should be glad that there's a place where that kind of ethos is in the air, even if it's challenging for some of us. And also some of these effects, the benefit of university having that kind of mission is not just the effect on you and on me. Mill makes this point too. It's possible that in you and I having a discussion, we actually just come to be frustrated and dislike each other and don't learn anything from each other. But there might be an effect on some third party, right? It's allowing us, even if you're firmly committed to your view and I'm firmly committed to my view, and we're never going to convince each other, but being able to have that variety of views get expressed could be beneficial for those who don't have settled views yet and are trying to learn, and are students maybe who are coming along and going to be trying to solve the world's problems going forward.
Yeah, that sounds true. What role does offense play into this? Like, does Mill set any limits on offensive speech? Or is it not really about offense? It's just about whether or not the person is trying to engage in a legitimate and sincere discussion.
Well, it could play a role. I mean, on my view of Mill, I think he thinks of offense as just a relatively lightweight harm. It's not that offense couldn't be pretty serious. Sometimes people say things that are actually denigrating and, try to put us in our place and turn us into second-class citizens, and, certain kinds of discriminated against groups are subject to this. And I think that goes beyond just offense. I think there you're actually trying to alter the sort of relationships among people in a discussion in a way that sort of threatens kind of the basic relational equality that's at stake in our democracy. But if we're just talking about offense, then I think Mill, even offense that someone feels very strongly, he thinks is still a relatively lightweight harm compared with the other considerations that are at stake in these questions about free discussion, or also like experiments in living. So it could be that I express some kind of controversial view and you're offended at that view. But if you're merely offended at the view, then it seems much more important to allow free discussion for the sake of learning, even if it offends some people. I think that on Mill's view, and so the good of allowing that discussion would outweigh the good of restricting it. Similarly, with like experiments in living, I think there's a kind of a clearer case. So imagine, you imagine someone who's offended at consensual homosexual relations, and says, "Well, I don't like it's harmful to me that people are out there, they're gay and they want to be married, and I'm finding that offensive." And I think Mill would say in that case, right, that that's a harm. We shouldn't discount that entirely. But it's much more important to allow people to be able to develop in their own way and express themselves in their lives, and to be able to engage with others in consensual relationships that help them flourish as they see fit. Like, that kind of consideration is just much weightier than the offense that someone else might be feeling.
I think it'd be helpful if we went through a couple of examples. So let's say that you had a couple of nudists, right? Like, that was their way to live. And they really believe that maybe it's unnatural for human beings to be clothed or something like that. And so they're walking around naked, right? Like, do you think Mill would believe it's justified to prohibit them from walking around naked?
We understand how Mill would pursue the argument, but I don't know exactly what the conclusion would be. So, right, we know that for Mill, the worry is if there's some kind of non-consensual harm to others, then that provides some basis on which society can at least take up the question of whether to restrict your behavior. But then there's still a question of like how significant that harm to others is and whether on balance it makes sense to actually restrict it. Just the fact that society sort of has a right to take up the question doesn't mean they actually should interfere. But he doesn't think, right, that society should consider interfering on the basis of paternalistic reasons that have to do with your own good. So if there's some nudists who think it's in their own good to walk around naked, society is not really in a position to say to them, look, that's really bad for you. That's not in your interest. Like somehow that it's indecent or something for you, and in a way that's going to potentially, you're going to go to hell or something like that. That's a the idea that someone's going to go to hell for doing something that's only self-regarding is a very powerful kind of paternalistic reason, but Mill takes those off the table. He says society shouldn't interfere for the paternalistic reason that has to do with how you want to live your own life for yourself. But again, if what you're doing, though, is now offending others or causing more of a social disturbance or potentially threatening people's safety, I don't know exactly what that would be, everybody craning their necks or something like that, looking at these nudists walking around. I mean, I think he then is at least open to the conversation about what the harms are that are involved and whether they could justify restricting the behavior of these nudists.
Yeah, that makes sense. This also makes me think about the limits of utilitarianism and my concerns with it, because if we are going to do this balancing of pros and cons, then we can always imagine scenarios where what the right decision is, whether or not to prohibit a particular behavior, is going to depend on what the majority of the people in that society think and feel, right? So let's imagine a society that's extremely homophobic, right? And all these people will be offended if like two guys kiss on a bus. Like if you got to weigh the pros and cons, and it seems that the pros of prohibiting that behavior would outweigh the cons.
Yeah, I think that's a serious worry. I mean, Mill might himself say, look, as a matter of fact, as he believes, the offense caused to people, again, is nothing compared with the good of allowing, say, that gay couple to live in the way that they see fit for themselves and express themselves in consensual relationship in the way that they want. And so that as a matter of how the actual best version of the utilitarian calculation would go, he might think like, utilitarianism would clearly allow this. But it is also true that, Mill was actually a very public-minded a person who was engaged in public affairs and served in Parliament for a few years. And he took very seriously the idea that, you needed to have an important utilitarian consideration was social coordination. And for social coordination and cooperation, you do have to take seriously what the prevailing views are in a given state of society. So it is, as a utilitarian, you do have to take seriously the thought that, like, if some people are doing something that is maybe in the ideal utilitarian calculation, fine, but is so challenging to social stability, then a utilitarian can't really ignore that consideration. So I think Mill could say that, like, in that case, what you have to do is you say, well, like, in the here and now, you take seriously social stability as a utilitarian consideration. That means there has to be some deference in certain ways to prevailing views. But also, as a public-minded reformer, which Mill was, I'm going to spend a bunch of my time trying to explain people why we should change those prevailing views, why we should change our social norms, why, for instance, in his case, he thought we should be moving in much more egalitarian direction, for instance, with respect to women's rights. I think that's the kind of balance, is like, yes, there's a social morality in place, and utilitarian can't ignore the prevailing views of a social morality in place for reasons, again, of having to do with social stability or coordination, those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean you can't also be advocating very strongly for changes to that social morality and finding a new basis for social coordination that you think does better with respect to what you think the correct utilitarian calculation actually is.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. All right, let's think about another case. Let's say there's a neo-Nazi, okay? and this person walks around with a swastika on his shirt, right? Causes great offense to people. And this person is also an activist. This person is not just a civilian. This person is well known in the community, and he also goes to events and gives speeches on white nationalism and preserving the white race. What do you think Mill would say is justified in terms of prohibiting his expression?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I think there's just different kinds of settings where some of this could be happening. So I do think, for instance, in some settings, like in an office, maybe even at a university, where there are certain considerations that have to do with creating a sense of a community and an effective workspace where people are able to get their work done, or at a university where everyone has a sense of belonging to the community, where there could be reasons specific to those settings that allow for certain kinds of restrictions. But then we'd have to talk about like what part of what you described in that person are the kinds of things that could be restricted. I do think, at least if we're talking in million terms, the at a university, in a debate setting or at some kind of like a political union meeting or something like that, the sincere expression of a Nazi opinion is something that probably should be allowed. But I think anything that sort of goes beyond that, I don't feel very confident about what I'm saying, I should just say, but like but I think anything that goes beyond that in a way that becomes threatening to others, so if this person is walking around with a swastika shirt and the aim is to intimidate others and make others feel uncomfortable, well, then going back to an earlier part of this conversation, then the thought is that is no longer discussion, but it's not merely discussion. It's taking part. It's an expression of opinion in a way that is taking part in some other kind of action now. It is becoming some other kind of thing called like intimidation that Mill, at least I think, would be open to talking about whether or not that could be restricted. But we don't know exactly where he would land on that. He wasn't as clear, but he did, he gave us some of these examples I mentioned earlier about where something becomes incitement or an instigation to some kind of criminal act or treason. And so we know that's the form of at least part of his argument.
I feel like one thing that makes this topic so difficult is that people's sensibilities differ, right? So the limits placed on someone's speech could depend on, it sounds like it would depend on other people's sensibilities. So even if it weren't a case like a person wearing a swastika shirt, right? Let's just say that this person expressed and held a particular position that wasn't as extreme as Nazism, but other people took it to be that extreme because they just happen to be extra sensitive. It seems that the prevailing sensibility would outweigh that person's right to free speech.
You mean the way that people often think about these things? I mean, I think on Mill's picture, no, it wouldn't. I mean, to the extent that this is part of the importance about, I think, seeing how much he really is just talking about fair-minded and sort of sincere discussion. And then what he's an absolutist about is not restricting viewpoints in that free and fair-minded discussion. The idea there is to have that not be so, I guess you're right in principle, people's sensibilities. So, if we're trying to talk about what potential harm of that discussion there is, you could imagine a case where, we're so constructed that like there's just so much harm in even discussing these things that Mill would have to take seriously a restriction on that, on even that discussion. But at least what he's trying to put on the table is this idea that when we're talking about discussion, the goods and harms always land on the side of allowing it. And I do think that is a good place to start, and maybe a good place to stay. The kind of argument that I'm a little bit more tempted by, for that I think is a Millian argument for some kind of regulation of discussion, is the one that has to do with that in a free marketplace of ideas where some people have louder voices and other people have quieter voices, we are potentially not really getting the full benefits of learning from each other. And so we might need to think about ways of lifting up some voices that are historically not heard so that we can get the full benefit. And now lifting up voices is, not necessarily silencing other voices. And so, but it might involve some kind of active effort to help promote a more sort of egalitarian free discussion that would encourage learning from others.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So one example that I had in mind was, the debate over abortion, right? So let's say, I was, philosophically, there is a legitimate debate to be had, but one side just thinks, let's say the pro-choice side thinks that the, pro-life side, what they're advocating for is just the oppression of women, right? So the mere fact that this discussion is even taking place, even on a college campus, is equivalent to a group of people advocating for the oppression of women. And I think that is where it becomes difficult, because then it just depends on what you think and feel about the opponent's position.
Yeah. I do think people understand that there are people on the anti-choice side. Have people who have sincerely held beliefs there. Maybe not all of them, but they have some sincerely held. But a lot of them have sincerely held beliefs, maybe grounded in some religious faith that they have about the nature of personhood and life, and I think that then the argument is, but they're not appreciating that actually what this amounts to is a kind of is oppressive for women, and that in some way women's rights should trump some of these other kinds of considerations that they have, and maybe in a pluralistic society we should not be trying to dictate one thing for everyone, right? I think then Mill would say, like, that's a conversation we need to be able to have where everyone is sincerely expressing their opinion, and that there really isn't another good option for us. There have to be spaces where people are able to hash these things out. It could be the case that some people are invested in a certain kind of power dynamic, a certain kind of hierarchy, where their belief system is one that sort of advances their own interests, and they enjoy their status and their position. And of course, that's always a possibility. And I think and then when people are coming from that kind of a perspective, I think it's fair to be skeptical about what they're saying. And maybe what they're saying is not really in the spirit of discussion. But I think there are always going to be people who have these sincerely held beliefs. And then I think we can't but feel like it's important that we have places where we can engage in really good discussion about those things.
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes sense, and I side with you on it, but I think it's because we are viewing it from the perspective of kind of like philosophers, right? And I'm able to acknowledge when there is a legitimate debate to be had, right? But I would say for a lot of people, maybe even most people, they perhaps may not be willing to do that, or just are unable to do that. So for them, the expression of this particular viewpoint is equivalent to that person inciting some sort of violence or some call to oppression. And I think that's where the trouble lies, because it all depends on how they think and feel about that particular viewpoint.
I agree. That's just this is where you get into this I don't know, calling it a gray area or a judgment call, but I agree that there's that's just one of these challenges that I don't think Mill has a clear answer for us on that. But I think we've been exploring at least how he wants to try to distinguish. And I think one thing we need to ask ourselves is sort of what's the alternative? Because if it really becomes the case that enough of us are, say, so offended by something, or worse than offended, but just like the mere expression of a position is in and of itself a kind of denigrating thing. It's a some kind of an oppressive thing. But that is a move that then can be available to all sides potentially. And then where does that leave us? And so I think it's always tempting in political disputes where your side has a bit of an advantage on something to try to push that advantage. But I think one of the lessons of kind of liberalism that Mill is so identified with is this sense of having some general rules that we try to hold in place for a pluralistic society that that are sort of understood to be important, whether or not we have the advantage at a given time or not. And so you're kind of respecting sort of minority opinions, is an important part of that. It is always tempting to sort of the tyranny of the majority. It's always tempting to sort of push your advantage and to push not just your advantage, but the view that you think is correct. But we see historically the danger of allowing one view to just run roughshod over all the other views. And so part of what liberalism is committed to is trying to always preserve space for there to be criticism, for there to be these other views being expressed. And I just don't know, exactly how to make that judgment call. I will say, I think that for discussion to happen well, there is a kind of presumption of at least of some kind of relational equality in the discussion. And so I think that there is a special kind of challenge for discussion when one side is expressing a viewpoint that essentially calls into question the other side's sort of right to be taking part in that discussion at all, because actually they're in some way second-class citizens, or you get that point. And so I think there is a kind of relational equality constraint on discussion, but I think that leaves open a lot of other discussion about, say, what equality or egalitarianism amounts to in all kinds of policy situations, and what specific rights people should have, even around things like abortion.
Sometimes I wonder what Mill would think if he were alive today, because I feel like the way that we communicate and the way that we get our information is just very different because of the internet. Like, we live in these echo chambers, right? But in a sense, I feel like he would be very bothered by that practice. Like, don't unfollow that person because, they said something you didn't like. Don't block that person because, they're against wearing masks.
Yeah. Although, he's also, that there are limits to what we can all do in a day. And so I think we have to take care of ourselves also. And so I think there's some balance. It doesn't mean hearing the other side does not mean that we're every day, every minute seeking out what the other side thinks and spending all our time engaging with them. But you do want to really understand the arguments of the other side, appreciate, in a charitable way, what they're trying to say, where they might be coming from, and so that you can then also articulate the reasons why you disagree with them. That isn't just about you expressing your own preferences or your own what Mill called likings and dislikings. But again, that does not mean we have to be following all these people on Twitter if every time we read them that makes us unhappy. What matters is that we understand where the sincere people among them might be coming from, and then trying to take that seriously as members of our democratic community that also have a right to have a say in how we organize ourselves.
I feel like the internet could be a great tool to enhance the quality of our debates and enhance free discussion. But I think the way that people use it is really in the opposite way, right? It's like, I don't want to hear what the other side has to say because I just don't like it. And it's to the point where I feel like a lot of people don't really know what the strongest version of the argument of the opposing sides is.
Yeah, no, I don't know that I have settled views on that, and it's complicated. I'm old enough that I remember, that what I used to do was I used to read magazines, news magazines, opinion magazines from across the political spectrum. And typically what you would get in those magazines then is you get a wide range of views from Mother Jones to National Review. But often those there was an understanding that those writers were trying to mount a reasoned argument. I mean, again, who knows what the motives were behind everything people are writing, but you had a chance to sit with an argument and consider where they were coming from. And often, at least, it was a kind of, I'll just say serious or relatively informed attempt to try to articulate something, even if you found at the end you thought these people were, you really disagreed with it for one reason or another. But on the internet, in the social media context, what you're often getting are just these people trying to either get attention or these one sentence version of views that lack any nuance or any effort. So it's just broad generalizations and bright lines and everything sort of right, stark and black and white and everything. So I don't think that actually, maybe this is part of what you're saying. I don't think Twitter is right now doing a very good job of being a kind of public space for discussion. I do think Twitter has been useful for some people as a source of having a kind of a news feed or information. Sometimes there are like really interesting writers who have a Twitter feed where they're like being able to provide, like, say, for instance, very good instant analysis of a recent Supreme Court decision. And if they're in your Twitter feed, you can get this kind of this great information coming right into your feed, kind of almost as a news source. But in general, I feel like, yeah, the spirit of what's happening there is kind of this augmenting of the like trying to win an argument, trying to like just take down the other side, rather than trying to articulate a more positive vision. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about how things used to be. Of course, there was always politics happening at the same time that these news magazines existed, and all kinds of just like public discourse has always been pretty bad in America.
Yeah, just from my own personal experience of what I've observed, the vast majority of the discussions that take place on the internet are pretty low quality for one reason or another, right? They're just, they become hostile, they're very combative, right? They're not charitable. And I think this is just a problem with the internet itself because it's so easily accessible and because you can be anonymous. You're not seeing that person face to face. And when you do that, you can easily dehumanize the other side, So this is why I think almost like a college campus and perhaps even like a philosophy classroom is what you need to counter that. It's like it's the polar opposite, right? You're there face to face with that other human being, you can't hide yourself, right? And you're just like placed in that situation where you are kind of encouraged to discuss, controversial issues, right? Like I feel like it's a necessary counterweight to Twitter. And look, like something like Twitter and the internet, I do feel like that there are advantages, like what you mentioned, right? If you follow somebody on Twitter who can give you an expert analysis on a current event, that's amazing, right? That's amazing. But all the commentary that follows that is terrible, absolutely terrible,
Yeah.
And so, this is some of the stuff that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I just was going to say the same thing you were just saying. I think we're really lucky. I mean, going back, we are having kind of the philosopher's version of this conversation and trying to think about what the principles are and the distinctions that might matter in trying to break down these cases and thinking about Mill in particular with respect to those issues. But another piece of that is I think, we are really lucky as philosophy professors that we're able to have certain conversations in our classroom where students come in and they get it that they're in a philosophy classroom and that there's going to be certain expectations in that classroom. And we say to them, like the whole idea of being here is to sort of reconsider your beliefs, to understand why you believe what you believe, and to try to be able to articulate it for others and to take seriously. And we try to create a space in that classroom where anybody can sort of try out an idea and not get ridiculed for it and try to be taken seriously, try to create the conditions of discussion as Mill was thinking about it. And then we get to have these wonderful conversations with our students that you just never see out on cable television or in other kind of public forums. But I don't know that there's an easy way to bring that kind of discussion into the public space.
Yeah, I feel that philosophy is extremely important. I think that everyone needs to take a philosophy class because I think the issues that are discussed are important, but also because there is a way to have a civil discussion that isn't intuitive to everybody, right? Some people can have a civil discussion without any, practice or anything like that. But I think for a lot of people, it's really a skill. And if you don't get the training, if you don't put in the work, then it's easy to fall to these very hostile discussions that people have on the internet. And so in a sense, what I'm worried about is a negative cycle, right? People are isolated and live in their echo chambers. And so they don't practice the skill of civil discourse. And so therefore it's that skill just never develops. And so anytime they do encounter somebody else who has an opposing view, they just start fighting.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say here at Ohio State, we had this sense that there was a critical mass of students who really felt the problem, felt that they weren't able to have constructive discussions with people they disagree with. And so there was kind of a hankering for what you might call civil discourse. And so we've started a civil discourse project, and the center that I'm director of is very involved in that. And actually, our program is called Civil Discourse for Citizenship. And working with students, basically, one of the ways that we try to get them introduced to the subject is we try to introduce them to the 4 C's, we call them. And they're be curious, be charitable, be conscientious, and be constructive. The ideas behind them are not original to us. We're trying to capture some pretty familiar ideas about the value of civil discourse, where be curious is acknowledging what you said earlier, that we have something to learn and have some humility. Be charitable is also trying to engage the other person as a real human being who trying to understand where they come from and representing their views in ways that they might understand their own views, but also allowing them to make mistakes potentially in the course of just discourse where, if they say something offensive that doesn't end the conversations necessarily, people can come back from those kinds of mistakes in discussion. Be conscientious is all about kind of being a good reasoner, attending to the evidence, making sure you're proportioning your claims to the evidence as best you can. And being constructive is about just trying to get to a place of better understanding or potentially finding common ground, but that's not required necessarily. But it's not about winning. It's about trying to make it the case that the next conversation is not just a repeat of this conversation, but where something's been learned in a way that can help us move forward. And so we really try to bring that to the students. I do want to emphasize something, which is that we try to say very clearly that civil discourse is not the only kind of interaction that's appropriate to a democracy. There definitely should be interest groups, and it's great for people to go protest at the state capitol, and there's room for all of that kind of part of in a healthy democracy as well. But we think there have to be spaces in a democracy where this kind of discussion, as Mill called it, or civil discourse, as we're now talking about, can happen. And universities seem like crucial place where that can happen. And so that's why we're pursuing this effort at Ohio State.
All right. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for this interview.
Well, thanks, Jason. I really, really appreciate being here. And good. Thanks very much.